Hello and welcome to the Civil War Project, where today I'm recapping the first half of Episode 5, titled A Man of Destiny from the limited series Manhunt on Apple TV+. I have been working on this whole episode for almost a month, and in some ways I feel like it's never going to be done, but here's the thing. This episode is covering a huge portion of the manhunt for Booth, and they're leaving out a lot of things, so there's just a lot to cover, in addition to the whole backstory regarding 40 acres and a mule. So I already have 70% of part 2 completed, so it should be out pretty soon, but I just wanted to get this first part out and done with, so you know I haven't given up. I'm going to recap each scene and then do a deep dive into what really happened, so you can walk away knowing the facts, which could come in handy someday if you're ever on Jeopardy or playing a trivia game with friends. Also, there are chapters in the description if you're looking for something specific. So let's talk Manhunt, Episode 5, Part 1. We see assassin John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirator David Herold arriving near a shore. Herold is rowing and Booth is leaning over in agony due to his broken leg. It's broad daylight and I don't see a single gunboat on the Potomac River. You'd swear that the only person looking for Booth in the entire United States is Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Herold decides to park their rowboat next to a Confederate soldiers' camp, which has a tent and several dead Confederates around it. One of the soldiers was wearing a hat showing they are from Texas. As Herold helps Booth walk onto the sacred sandy beach, he asks where the compass is, and Booth tells him it's back in the boat. Herold goes back to retrieve it, and Booth sits among the dead and talks about how he almost enlisted once. Low wages, terrible food, poor fellas. Ugh, and the uniforms. Yuck. He likes to choose his own look. He wonders what position they'll give him when he gets to Richmond. General, he reckons. Oh, so he just hates the low-level ranking uniforms then. Maybe he can work with Confederate President Davis on a new uniform design especially for him, or maybe General Robert E. Lee will give him the coat off his back, the sword in his hand, and his white horse traveler. Anything for the man who is the symbol of the cause, right? Herold, normally keen to hang on Booth's every word and confirm how amazing he is freaking out. He's staring at the sky, looking for God, so he can ask him why has he done this to them. Booth is like, what, are we further away from Richmond than we thought? Herold looks like he's gonna cry, as he has to admit they aren't even in Virginia. Booth is like, don't play games. You know I hate games. My brother Edwin always beat me in every game we played, probably because he's a big stupid cheater. Herold looks at him, telling him they must have circled back. Booth's eyes are laser focused as he asks angrily where they are, and even calls him David. Oh boy, Herold's in the hot seat if Booth is calling him David instead of Davy. It's like when you're a kid and your parent calls you by your first and middle name, you know you're in trouble. Herold says they're in Maryland, it was cloudy and he couldn't see the stars. Booth swears and throws his makeshift crutch, almost hitting Herold in the process. Herold's solution, though, is to steal the clothes off 2 Confederate soldiers for them to wear. Yes, to get across the river into Virginia. That seems like a great strategy. Okay, Herold gives Booth his crutch back and they start taking off the clothing. Booth and Herold take off around midnight on April 20th after a rowboat directions and a name are given to them by Thomas Jones, who they've modeled the river ghost after. Jones gives Booth a candle and a compass and tells him to make sure it points a certain direction so it gets them across the Potomac River into Virginia in a specific area. There is a woman, Mrs. Quisenberry, who lives near there and he thinks she'll help them if they say Jones sent them. Booth pays Jones for the rowboat and they take off on a dark and foggy night. There are Union gunboats patrolling that river in anticipation of Booth and Herold crossing it. They're not just watching, they're also listening. Herold does the rowing, but Booth is in charge of the compass. If he lights the candle, he has to keep it hidden by putting his coat over it. If he doesn't light it, he'll only have the light the night sky gives him. There's a great description in the actual book Manhunt that says the Potomac River is as dark as India ink. I've been there many times at night near the area they launched from, and it's really the perfect description, even today. If there is no moon and stars, it almost feels like a void. You can't see the shores of Maryland and Virginia, so I can understand how confusing that must have been for them to be in this tiny rowboat on a dark and foggy evening. At some point, Booth looks at the compass and realizes they are further north than their launch point, and they are still on the Maryland side. It's early in the morning, the sun is starting to come up, and Herold realizes he knows where they are along with the family that lives near there and that they may help them. Herold gets the rowboat onto shore and he hides it. Booth stays there while Herold goes to Indiantown Farm, owned by John J. Hughes. Herold asks for help, but Hughes finds it too dangerous to have them stay at the house, as the wanted poster showing the reward money for Booth, Herold, and John Surratt is out, and the countryside is swarming with men. He puts them up in an empty slave cabin on his property where the two will continue to get food and news until they leave. April 21st passes, and when it's nighttime, for a reason we'll never know, they stay there. It could have been that maybe there wasn't enough light in the sky, maybe they saw a gunboat or two too close to their location, maybe Herold's arms were tired. We'll never know, but they did nothing. Let me correct that actually, because Booth does do something. He writes an entry in his appointment book, and it's the last diary entry he will make. I think it gives insight into how Booth was feeling and what he was thinking at this point. I understand the premise of the series and their key focus, but because it is called Manhunt, there is one tiny little thing I'm disappointed in. Just one. The lack of real development and change in John Wilkes Booth's character during his 12 days on the run. I've done the escape route several times, usually at night when there are few people around. There is one thing that stands out to me every time, and that is just how much Booth probably felt this invisible hand keeping him from progressing further as each day passed by. From Friday night of April 14th to Sunday early morning of April 16th, he makes exceptional progress, but then he's stuck in a pine thicket for 5 days. This is the time where he can finally read the newspapers that Thomas Jones provides him with, and he is shocked and angry at what he's reading because it's not the glorious praise he was expecting, especially from the Southern papers. Getting on that rowboat was probably a high point of his week, but to end up in an even worse position and still in Maryland had to just infuriate him. So I think it's important to share what he wrote so we can understand what Booth was really thinking and feeling at this point in the manhunt. It's a little long, but you can skip to the next chapter if you wish. It's important to keep in mind that Booth likely wrote this for public consumption, so it's the story he wanted to tell, not necessarily the most truthful version of the story. So here it goes. Until today, nothing was ever thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months we had worked to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. But its failure was owing to others who did not strike for their country with a heart. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted 'Sic Semper' before I fired. In jumping, broke my leg. I passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it, though he hated to kill. Our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. This country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country. The night before the deed, I wrote a long article and left it for one of the editors of the National Intelligencer, in which I fully set forth our reason for our proceedings. He or the government, and then this is interesting, he stops here, and he doesn't finish the thought. After being hunted like a dog through swamps and woods, and last night being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return, wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, what made William Tell a hero, and yet I, for striking down an even greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat. My act was purer than either of theirs. One hoped to be great himself. The other had not only his country's, but his own wrongs to avenge. I hoped for no gain. I knew no private wrong. I struck for my country, and her alone. A people ground beneath this tyranny prayed for this end, and yet now see the cold hands they extend to me. God cannot pardon me if I have done wrong, yet I cannot see any wrong except in serving a degenerate people. The very little I left behind to clear my name, the government will not allow to be printed. So ends all. For my country I have given up all that makes life sweet and holy. Tonight misfortune upon my family, and I am sure there is no pardon for me in the heavens, since man condemns me so. I have only heard of what has been done, except what I did myself, and it fills me with horror. God, try and forgive me, and bless my mother. Tonight I will once more try the river, with the intention to cross, though I have a greater desire and almost a mind to return to Washington, and in a measure clear my name, which I feel I can do. I do not repent the blow I struck. I may before God, but not to man. I think I have done well, though I am abandoned with the curse of Cain upon me, when, if the world knew my heart, that one blow would have made me great, though I did desire no greatness. Tonight I try once more to escape these bloodhounds. Who can read his fate? God's will be done. I have too great a soul to die like a criminal. Oh, may he spare me that, and let me die bravely. I bless the entire world. I have never hated or wronged anyone. This last was not a wrong, unless God deems it so, and it is with him to damn or bless me. And for this brave boy, Herold, here with me, who often prays, yes, before and since, with a true and sincere heart, was it a crime in him? If so, why can he pray the same? I do not wish to shed a drop of blood, but I must fight the course. 'Tis all that's left me. So, thank you for humoring me, but I hope now you can understand how Booth's mood should be at this point. And it's beyond just getting a little frustrated with directions on a boat. It's a lot more than that. Because all we've seen Booth read are newspapers that say he's the symbol of a cause, and newspaper clippings that he wants to send to his mom that are all positive. And the thing is, they weren't all positive. There were a lot that were negative. And whether or not they really believed that, or they were just playing a role because they didn't want some sort of retaliation against them, there were many who did not think it was a gentlemanly way to behave. The war should be fought on a battlefield and not shooting a gun at an unarmed man in a theater. Now, there are probably two questions you have, though. You're probably asking, what did he mean about a letter to the National Intelligencer? Well, on April 14th, Booth writes a long letter, and he gives it to his longtime friend and actor, John Matthews, who is staying at the Peterson boarding house. And yes, that's the same Peterson house that President Lincoln dies in. It's in a sealed envelope, and Booth asks that Matthews deliver it to the editor of a newspaper Saturday morning unless Booth stops and sees him before then. Matthews is in shock at the assassination at Ford's while he was there, and eventually he goes back to his room at the Peterson boarding house, which is upstairs from Lincoln's room. Booth's letter falls out of his jacket as he's going up the stairs, and he had completely forgotten about it. Instead of grabbing it and giving it to one of the soldiers or one of the cabinet members or one of the many people downstairs, instead he grabs it, takes it to his room, shuts the door, and reads it. It is all anyone would need to hang Booth for his deed. It spells out everything he's going to do in 3 pages. Booth even signed it with his own name and also included the last names of the other 3 people who were going to be assassins that night. So he signed it Payne, which is Lewis Powell's alias, Herold, and Atzerodt. Matthews puts it in his bedroom fireplace, and he watches it burn, for fear he'll be implicated just for having it in his possession. He eventually does fess up to it. He tells what he has done. He tries to summarize it to detectives, and he also tries to summarize it to some newspapers. But basically, it was a manifesto. The second question people probably would have is, what does he mean when he says, I've only heard of what has been done except what I did myself, and it fills me with horror? That is in regards to what he has read in the papers about the Seward home attacks. He feels sorry for the girl, Seward's daughter Fanny, who witnessed most of the bloody scene, and also Seward's 2 sons that Powell attacked. Booth, being an honorable gentleman, didn't feel the children of Seward deserved to be attacked or were meant to witness the attack on their father. He only wished for their father to die. So, there's a difference. So the episode is correct. They end up back in Maryland on their first attempt to cross the Potomac River. They do not come across dead Confederate soldiers and steal their clothes. Booth dies in the same clothes he was wearing on April 14th. There is one point further in the real story where Booth offers to trade his suit for a Confederate's uniform, but the soldier declines even though he feels the suit is good quality, though horribly dirty at this point. It's daylight at a Union camp and it's raining. A Union soldier sits on a chair alone while most of the other soldiers are in their tents for shelter or moving quickly to get out of the rain. Two officers who are sitting in a tent are talking about how there are no leads on Booth as they pour themselves an alcoholic beverage. You might recognize one man, Lieutenant Luther Byran Baker, Detective Lafayette Baker's cousin, who was acting as his eyes and ears in the 16th New York Cavalry. We have not seen him since episode 2, when he did a not-so-detailed questioning session of Dr. Mudd at his farm. The other man you have not been introduced to, but this is Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger, who also works for Lafayette Baker as a detective. In reality, these two men were incredibly important, along with one other individual who we will not see in the series. His name was Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, and he was the one chosen to lead a detachment from the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment. Doherty reported to Detective Lafayette Baker. Conger and Lieutenant Baker were assigned with a detachment. While episodes 1 through 4 have shown Secretary of War Edwin Stanton doing most of the investigative work, in reality it was Doherty, Conger, and the Bakers who did the heavy lifting. Remember that reward money that is on the table? Though that division of the reward money becomes highly political, in the end it is split up this way. Everton Conger receives the most at $15,000. Edward Doherty receives $5,250. Luther Byran Baker only receives $3,000, and each soldier in the 16th New York Cavalry Detachment receives $1,653.84. So, the two men who received the largest payout are either minimized, like Conger, or left out, like Doherty, for ease of storytelling. These, however, are the men that were credited in finding Booth and Herold. As for the discussion between Conger and Baker that there are no leads on Booth, this is fictional. There are plenty of leads at this point, but it takes a lot of time to check them out, as many of them end up being nothing. Back to the story. Baker looks outside at the soldier sitting in the rain and asks Conger if the Mad Hatter knows it's raining, or does he just not care? Conger replies that God told him to, castrate himself, and he did it. Baker snickers until Conger tells him no, it's true, after which you read his mind and he's kind of like, wow, okay. Conger says Mad Hatter has also been breathing in hat chemicals for 10 years, so who knows what he's thinking. We then get a really cool aerial shot of Sergeant Corbett as he prays in the rain. We learn that the Lord took his family but not him, and ever since he's prayed to serve him. He wants to know why everything has to be this hard. When will you show me? He asks as he closes his eyes and looks towards the sky. We then immediately go back to Corbett in snowfall, looking up with his eyes open 10 years before the assassination. Sitting on the dirty ground as the snow falls, what looks to be an alcoholic bottle in his left hand, we see he is dirty, his clothes are largely in tatters, and he has no socks, shoes, or winter coat. Ladies' hats half price today, he says in a low voice as a male rider on a horse passes him. We see a few hats to the right of him, and they look quite nice. He takes a swig from a bottle, and a preacher comes up and drops some coin next to him. What happened to you, my child? He asks. Corbett says he wasn't sinned against, he's the sinner. His wife Emily died in childbirth, and if he didn't have these base desires, she would still be there. The preacher asks for his name, and we learn it's Tom Corbett. Corbett says there is only shame linked to it. The preacher tells him to cast it away and be reborn, like, it's so easy, even a caveman can do it. Corbett's like, I think I'm caveman smart, how do I do it? And the preacher looks around, and finally his eyes focus on a sign reading Boston Commons and Public Gardens this way. The preacher renames him Boston Corbett and baptizes him right there on the sidewalk. With his new name and his old sins taken from his shoulders, he looks up at the snow and smiles. So Corbett was born in England and he came to New York when he was a child. He He apprenticed as a milliner. This unfortunately subjected him to mercury nitrate, which was used as a treatment of fur to produce felt. Historians have theorized that this is what led to his mental state, which was often questionable. He had a wife named Susan, not Emily, who was 13 years his senior. He became a U.S. citizen. They moved to Virginia, but 2 years into the marriage, because of his anti-slavery beliefs, the couple took a ship back to New York, and Susan dies while giving birth to a stillborn child. Corbett moves to Boston and becomes an alcoholic who was often wandering the streets and was largely unable to keep a job. One day, he was confronted by a Methodist preacher, and he begins to turn his life around. He becomes a member of the Methodist Episcopalian Church. He changes his first name from Thomas to Boston, and eventually is known for his own sermons on the street. He grows a beard and grows out his hair to mimic Jesus. In July 1858, he is on the streets and he's approached by two women of the evening. Let's put it that way. He does not do anything with them, but he's alarmed at how tempted he feels, so he ends up reading the Bible. He finds a verse that leads him to believe that the only way to get rid of such urges is to castrate himself. So he does, with a pair of scissors at his home, followed by a mule and attending a sermon at church. He doesn't receive medical care until someone finds out what he's done. You can now see how this is a man who is prone to take things to the extreme. Many people still liked him though and supported him because they felt he had a good heart, even if his brain was mad. Now in 1861, a 29-year-old Corbett enlists for the Union. He had trouble with several commanders as he didn't see the war as an excuse for drinking alcohol, swearing, etc. He would be praised for his public speaking, taking care of others, and having no fear. In 1864, he became a prisoner of war in Andersonville, the most notoriously horrible prisoner of war camp in the Confederacy. At Andersonville, he was known for helping the sick or wounded, giving sermons, praying with them, and even leading patriotic rallies to keep Union morale up. He is released in 1864 and treated for malnutrition, scurvy, and exposure. He rejoins his regiment, and this is the complex man who is now with the 16th New York Calvary pursuing John Wilkes Booth. To my knowledge, he was not asking God at this time to show him his purpose, but it's a very good way to quickly show a complex character who is not quite right in the head, but seems to want to be a good person. And I do think they did a really good job showing that in much less time than I have. Moving on. We're now back at the White House with President Andrew Johnson, who is talking with 3 Southern leaders. I'm not sure why this would be a thing just days after Lincoln's assassination when the war is not even over. The Southern states don't even start to get their congressional representation back until 1867. But really the purpose of this is to show how much Johnson really was more sympathetic to the Southern side than what Lincoln was, and the difference in the two men. And that's the main goal of this next section here. We hear Johnson repeating the same old story we've heard before. He was poor, he didn't attend school, he didn't get free land, so he could buy people and be like these other less dressy men in the room because he learned to be a tailor instead, hence why he's so fancy. He sympathizes with their sob stories of how their slaves and assets were taken by force. Same thing happened to him. No, it didn't. But these men had British grandpappies who got the free land when America was founded, and Johnson missed out on all that, but then starts singing the chorus of Phil Collins' song, "Take a Look at Me Now," as the men smile and clap with delight. Outside, protesters are chanting Johnson is illegitimate, and Johnson shouts back, "I'm not illegitimate, just the 2 kids I had with my enslaved teenager Dolly are." Okay, he doesn't say that. Oh, and I should say, allegedly. Johnson tells the men that the protesters are nonstop and they keep him up at night. Johnson goes back to a speech about them having to pick themselves up by their bootstraps because that's what he did. They don't understand what Johnson means though, because that bootstraps line wasn't a thing until the late 1800s. The men start complaining that the freedmen own land, next year they'll get the vote. Has Johnson thought this through? Does he think they'll stop at taking their land? Johnson tries to blame Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, saying that Stanton says there will be unrest as long as the black man is beneath them. This one old guy in the group yells out, "Police him!" He's funny. And another one says, "Yeah, they're gonna take our wives, our daughters, and our businesses. Cities and states will be run by black people." Then that creepy old guy again shouts out that at this rate, Johnson's gonna lose his seat, to a word I will not be repeating here. Interesting, isn't it, that enslavers used to say that slavery was in the best interest of the slave who was inferior, but now they're basically admitting that an educated slave will be more successful than they are in literally everything. The three Southern men laugh, and Johnson doesn't really get it. They stand, and one of the younger men says, "Guess what? We're protesting you too. Here's the petition against the land grants. We can get more signatures if needed to help with your problem." Of course, Johnson wants to know what problem. Yeah, it's the Stanton problem. They leave, Johnson looks grim, and we go to opening credits. Okay, a few historical points I want to make. First, Johnson did dwell about how he was just a plebe and wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth quite a bit in his speeches, so if his talk seems a bit repetitive here, it was likely really repetitive for those that knew him. Johnson says his slaves and his land were taken by force, but he probably should have mentioned that his land and home were taken by the Confederacy. Confederates had a stronghold over eastern Tennessee where Johnson and his family lived. His wife would go to stay with her daughter, and Confederates occupied their home and even drew and wrote little messages for Johnson on their walls. And some of them are actually still there today. If you go to Greenville, Tennessee, it's in northeastern Tennessee, the house is there, and there actually is some writing still on the walls. It's awesome. But Johnson gets his house and his land back, so no, he didn't have the Union take his land as part of the 40 acres and a mule order. Plus, as I've mentioned before, that order only impacted coastal Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. It wouldn't have been Tennessee or Maryland, where Mary Sims received her land in episode 3. Johnson's wife actually told their enslaved persons on August 8, 1863, that they were free and they could go or stay if they wished. Most stayed and then were paid servants. That date is still celebrated in Tennessee as Emancipation Day. One enslaved person, Dolly, had 3 children during her time with the Johnson family, and 2 of them were rumored to be the children of Andrew Johnson. Her youngest child, William, had on his death certificate that his father was Robert Johnson, Andrew's son. Robert and Dolly were about the same age. Also, I know we've seen Johnson meeting with what appears to be Southern congressional leaders in episode 2 and in this episode. While the South would not have had their congressional status reinstated until 1867 at the earliest, as it was different for each state, Johnson did believe that secession was illegal, and therefore Southerners should immediately have their representation back in Congress. I do want to point out that Johnson is not a lawyer, unlike Stanton or Lincoln. As for the protesters, I can't find evidence of protesting at this point in Johnson's presidency. Mary Lincoln was still occupying the White House, so they would not have been protesting there day and night, even if that is true. People, however, would certainly be voicing their opinions about Johnson. They'd be writing their congressional leaders and other politicians, and they'd also be showing up at their offices to talk to them about how they felt. The public had a lot more access to their politicians to complain, request, demand, etc. Even at the White House, people would line up each day to talk to the president, and he would hear them out. So there were many Republicans who obviously were very unhappy that Johnson was president, and no doubt they were working behind the scenes to see if they could undo it somehow. But in the end, the best they could do down the line was impeachment in 1867, and Johnson gets to continue to finish out the rest of his presidency by 1 vote. Edwin Stanton, his son Eddie Stanton, and the nondescript Union soldier I referred to as a Star Trek red shirt in the last recap ride up on horses to a Union camp. It just so happens it's the 16th New York Calvary, with Conger, Baker, and the newly introduced Corbett. Stanton gathers the men and says he's tasking them with finding Booth and his accomplice David Herold. So this is likely almost 2 weeks since Lincoln died, and they're just now getting to this task. They've literally been just sitting around drinking and playing card games in Maryland until just now. Well, the real world answer is no, but the episode answer is yes. As Stanton has Eddie pass out maps of the secret line, which of course is that map that we saw at the end of episode 4, we see a shot of Boston Corbett and a little light bulb goes off in his head. His prayers have been answered. Stanton says that the cavalry are to check every address, every home, tavern, chicken coop, especially the chicken coop because Booth and Herold are such chickens. Stanton says good luck and Godspeed and rides off with Eddie in the red shirt, and Corbett, well, you can probably guess Corbett's overcrazed reaction. We now see a beautiful overhead shot, and there in broad daylight are Booth and Herold dressed as Confederate soldiers in a rowboat. Obviously, the Confederate uniforms they stole are doing a great job acting as a cloaking device. We get a series of shots to show the passage of time. Herold rowing, Booth taking off his hat like he's exhausted, Herold stops rowing for a few moments and then starts again, and then finally they hit shore. Herold gets out and pulls the rowboat in more as Booth is impatiently snapping his fingers repeatedly. Well, that's just annoying. Herold helps pull him out of the boat, and Booth starts moving on that crutch pretty fast. I don't think he's even had any whiskey since the pine thicket, so this just shows us how happy and renewed Booth is now that he's on Virginian soil. Herold says he had some doubts, but as he looks at his compass and confirms whatever it shows, he tells Booth he thinks he's actually going to get them to Richmond. Booth, of course, doesn't say anything because he is too far ahead of Davy to hear a word of it. He is just gone, out of sight. Now that they are out of Maryland and the enormous rowing task is over, I have a feeling that Booth will be ditching Davy real soon. That's unless they're captured before he can leave Herold for better people. We're now with Edwin Stanton, Eddie, and the 16th New York Cavalry. The last time we saw this cavalry, they weren't even close to being ready to mount horses, but somehow they're now riding with Stanton. Okay. Suddenly Stanton sees something and has everyone stop. Through the thick trees, he sees someone rowing, and Eddie asks if it's them. I kind of laugh because in episode 3, a whole cavalry unit rode by Booth, Herold, and Oswell Swan in a very thin forest, and completely missed them, including their 3 horses. But Stanton has that eagle eye of a Sherlock Holmes, and I say that as a compliment, as my brother and father love Sherlock Holmes. But in all seriousness, this makes my point as to why it would be ridiculous for Booth and Herold to row across the Potomac River to Virginia in broad daylight. Well, it turns out that what Stanton sees are just 2 women in a rowboat. Then, in the distant air, we start to hear that familiar song that we heard in episode 4, Dixie. Yep, we have a band of Confederate soldiers marching through the border state of Maryland. Stanton gives a turnaround signal to the cavalry and he keeps in the lead as they head towards the group of slightly off-key singers. If you love horses, you'll love the cool shots they have of the horses throughout this episode. The Kentucky Derby needs to take some lessons from this production team. Stanton, Eddie, and the cavalry block off the soldiers and they all stop in their tracks. The Confederate soldiers look like they're the human equivalent of the island of misfit toys. Old, injured, battered, broken. A younger man with the eye patch over his left eye finds himself front and center as Lieutenant Colonel Conger says they are looking for the president's murderers. Have they seen them? Well, I thought just one person murdered the president, technically, but I'm happy they're acknowledging Herold in this episode. He would probably wish differently, though. The soldier with the eye patch says they haven't seen them and they don't want trouble. They have served for 4 years and are almost home. We learn that these men are from Port Conway and Bowling Green, Virginia. The Confederate de facto leader says they've turned in their weapons and they're on their way to sign their allegiance once they get to Port Royal. The soldier even throws in a "God bless America." Well, that's not reassuring considering the last time we heard that phrase it was by John Wilkes Booth at the Star Saloon right before he shot President Lincoln. If you look at a map and find U.S. Route 301, it crosses from Maryland into Virginia. There is then another river Booth and Herold will have to cross, and that is the Rappahannock River. Port Conway is north of that river, and directly across from it on the south side is Port Royal. Continuing down U.S. Route 301, Bowling Green is then about 13 miles south of Port Royal. These are all important places in northern Virginia because Booth and Herold in real life will hit the first 2, and Herold will end up in Bowling Green for one night, separated from Booth. Stanton looks the misfit toy soldiers over and tells Conger to search and question them. We then hear a voice from behind Stanton, and it's a courier with a message from the head of the telegraph office at the War Department, Tecumseh Eckert, who we last saw in episode 3. Stanton reads the telegram and he is ticked. He tells Eddie that Johnson is rolling back Reconstruction. He wants to reverse the land grants. Eddie asks how many, and Stanton says it's all of them. Eddie wonders if Johnson can do that, and Stanton looks down in a way and says, yeah, he can. We now flash back to 3 months prior, but the exact historical date would have been January 12, 1865. We see the outside of a home with a Union Guard outside, and I'm completely giddy because this is the Green Meldrum House in Savannah, Georgia. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous march to the sea ended in Savannah, and the Green family immediately offered up their home when he arrived on December 22, 1864. This house would serve as Sherman's headquarters, where he composed a message that was sent to President Lincoln stating, "I beg to present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. My husband and I visited the home back in 2016, and it is stunning inside." It was incredibly special when you think about it, not just being Sherman's headquarters, but also that it was the place where this first ever type meeting that we're about to see took place. We hear Stanton's voice saying, "We're here to see General Sherman." We go inside the home, and Stanton is leading 2 African Americans towards a room, and before the 2 enter, one of them whispers, "Here goes nothing." As they walk into the room, we see Sherman looking at a piece of paper, and Stanton introduces these men as a delegation of preachers representing the freedmen of Georgia. Sherman looks at them briefly and then turns his back and looks at a map of Georgia, which seems kind of rude. "What would most improve conditions?" he asks, back still turned away from his guests. That first preacher responds that owning their own land would help them build capital and invest in American enterprise. The other preacher says they were once property by law, now they want to own property to gain a foothold as a people. Most enslaved people were freed without a thing, but property would mean they can farm their own land, earn their own wages, feed their families, and protect their women and children. This entire time, Stanton is listening eagerly and also quietly, especially for Stanton. I feel like he usually talks a lot, and I get the feeling he's already talked with the preachers ahead of time, and they have a firm game plan before this meeting. Not in real life necessarily, just in this episode. Sherman eventually turns around and looks a little strained, looking like he maybe has something better to do. I prefer to think that he's thinking logistically about how all this will happen, because Sherman was quite intelligent, and I don't know if his brain or mouth ever shut down. Well, it did when he became depressed, which happened on several occasions. One due to Stanton, which the series will not show, so I will talk about it at the end of the episode, as I promised I would do in episode 4. Stanton asks what Sherman thinks, and Sherman says it's controversial, to say the least. He sits down at what is probably a dining room table, while the others continue to stand. One preacher says thanks to Sherman's leadership, they have been able to confiscate miles of coastal land. Stanton asks Sherman if he would order the army to enforce land grants. Sherman says his main concern isn't moral, it's logistical. He wants to know how many land grants they have in mind. The preachers pull out a map of the Carolinas and Georgia that Stanton drew up, so I was correct, he did plan with the preachers ahead of time and all this, at least in the episode, and it equals 40,000 tracts. Sherman asks if this is all at once, and Stanton says it will be 6,000 grants through the summer. 40 acres for each freedman, and a mule once they can be spared by Sherman's men. Sherman asks about the other 30,000 plus tracts, and Stanton says if it goes to plan, before winter. Sherman thinks hard about it, and we get shots of everyone on pins and needles waiting for his response. He eventually says fine, let's redistribute the coast. One of the preachers gets down on his knees and prays. Sherman says that his mother taught him the old saying, "The meek shall inherit the earth." They've all seen how well freedmen fight. Meek, no more. Mr. Green has lent him this beautiful house while they're controlling the South, but he still misses his own damn pillow. Everyone should have a place to call home, so where does he sign? Stanton provides him with Field Order 15, and Sherman signs it, and it appears it's the last signature needed, as there are 7 others, including President Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, and a few others I can't quite make out. Stanton shakes Sherman's hand and says, "Thank you, William. I understand the political risk you take." In the recap and deep dive for Episode 3, I did talk briefly about Sherman's Special Field Order 15, dated January 16, 1865. There had been Republicans in Congress, such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who had been pushing for land distribution. After Sherman's successful march to the sea, President Lincoln eventually decides to send Stanton to Savannah with the order to facilitate a conversation with Sherman over what to do with the plantations. When Sherman and Stanton meet, Stanton thinks of the idea to ask leaders in the African American community in Savannah and the region what they wanted for themselves. When Sherman had arrived in Savannah, he had been visited by several preachers, one of them Garrison Frazier. A meeting was decided upon, and Frazier was given the task of identifying the other 19 preachers to be invited to this meeting of the minds. Stanton and Sherman met with 20 preachers from the region at Sherman's headquarters at 8 p.m. on January 12, 1865. Garrison Frazier would do most of the speaking for the group of 20, though at times the other 19 were asked to confirm or identify any differences. There's an interesting newspaper account from the New York Tribune of the questions asked and the answers given. I found a transcript on the Freedmen and Southern Societies Project website, and I will put the link in the description so you can read it. I highly suggest you read it, as it really helps give a very good account of how African American leadership and the community itself felt about key issues at this point in time. The preachers are asked questions about their understanding of the Emancipation Proclamation, if there's enough intelligence amongst the enslaved in the South to maintain themselves under U.S. government law, and to maintain good and peaceable relations, to name a few. They are even asked if they would prefer to live scattered among the white man or in colonies by themselves. The answers of the preachers show great intelligence, keen observation, and so much more. I could never do it justice, which is why I'm really going to suggest you check out the link. At one point, Sherman even leaves the room so the preachers can be asked about how African Americans feel about Sherman regarding his sentiments and his actions, as to whether they're friendly to the rights and interests of African Americans or otherwise. I think that's great, because if Sherman and his men were going to manage the land grants, they would need to know he was trusted by the African American community, and I have no doubt Sherman would have wanted the question asked without him in the room so the men could speak freely. The outcome of this meeting was Special Field Order 15, signed by Sherman on January 16, 1865. It confiscated property along the coastal shorelines of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Sherman's hope is that it will help the over 10,000 freedom seekers that had joined his men on his march to the sea, when his men went from Atlanta to Savannah in 36 days. He didn't have the men, resources, or time to deal with this kind of crisis while he's on a military campaign that will help end the war, finally, after almost 4 years. And he's about to head into South Carolina. Today, the order is referred to as 40 acres and a mule, but the mule would come later. It also doesn't fully represent the 3 key points of the order. 1. It identified coastal lands set aside and made free by the acts of war and President Lincoln. 2. That these new communities would be entirely governed by African Americans themselves, and no white person except those serving in the military and assigned there would be allowed to reside there. And 3. That each family would get no more than 40 acres of tillable land. What resulted was incredibly positive for the African American community. One of the Baptist ministers, Ulysses L. Houston, led 1,000 African Americans to Skidaway Island, Georgia, where they established a community with Houston as the governor. By June 1865, 40,000 freedmen had been settled on 400,000 acres of what was called Sherman land. Later on, Sherman would order that the army could lend the new settlers mules, because you really need a horse or mule to work the land, and mules were cheaper and easier to come by during and after wartime. And this is how we now have the phrase 40 acres and a mule. So in reality, the 40 acres and a mule idea came from the minds of these 20 African American preachers and community leaders. President Lincoln did approve of it before it was issued, once the outcome of their meeting had been communicated to him. It was easier to do this militarily than through Congress. When Stanton says to Sherman that he understands it's a political risk, the real Sherman wouldn't have cared. He hated politicians and he hated newspapers. He would refuse to serve in any political capacity, and when some wanted him to run for president years later, he famously said, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." And trust me, he meant it. His brother, John Sherman, was a senator from Ohio. He would come up with the famous Sherman antitrust laws that are still in place today. But politics was really not for the general that his men would call Uncle Billy. He was happiest as a military man working with his men. And as far as capturing the essence of Sherman in this brief exchange, I'm not sure it's as on the nose as it could have been, but I thought it was pretty good. Sherman is pretty gruff, enormously talkative, and his brain goes a mile a minute. That high-strung energy just wasn't quite there. But I did like the use of his word damn, because that word is very much a Sherman thing. And Sherman was pretty blunt and doesn't have a filter and used words like that quite often. So it made me smile. As far as the religious quote from his mother, I think the writer thought it would be a good line to have here. Sherman's birth mother wasn't incredibly religious. When his father died unexpectedly when he was 9, his mother couldn't handle the 10 kids in the household. A powerful neighbor and family friend who would eventually become a U.S. Senator from Ohio, Thomas Ewing, said he would take one of the children, but he wanted the smartest one. It was Sherman's sister Elizabeth who then spoke up and said to take Cump, which was his nickname the birth family used for him, short for Tecumseh, as he was the smartest. Now, Ewing's wife was a devout Catholic, but I don't think Sherman would have referred to her as his mother. Luckily, he was able to walk down the street to see his mother and the 3 siblings that she kept, though one can imagine how it would have led him to having questions about where exactly he fit in. I think it would take him decades to figure that out, but the Civil War would prove to be the place where he was the perfect and much-needed fit that the Union needed and that he needed as well. We see someone playing a card game, and then we see and hear Stanton saying, "This country will have a permanent poor." Of course, he's talking to Johnson. Let's see, so far in Johnson's presidency of about 2 weeks, we've seen him overseeing the redecorating, hosting a party for Southerners, meeting with Southerners, and now playing what I think is solitaire. Lincoln's ghost is like, how is it that this guy has the time to sit around and do literally nothing? I didn't even get a day of that kind of presidential life. Poor Lincoln's ghost. Anyway, Johnson asks why black people can't be self-made, like him and Stanton. Oh, don't even try to drag Stanton into that line of thinking, sir. Stanton snaps rightfully back that Johnson owned slaves. How's that self-made? Johnson admits that he hadn't read that Reconstruction Plan thing before, but now he has, and it doesn't sit right with him giving away so much for free. I have a feeling he didn't read the whole Reconstruction report, but instead just looked at the index and read the small part about the land grants. I can't imagine this guy ever read anything from front to back. It just doesn't seem like that's within his character. Johnson wants to complain that it doesn't sit right with him, but I'm pretty sure it didn't sit right with 4 million enslaved people in this country that were forced into giving free labor every day for a lifetime. Stanton rightly argues that they cannot free these people into society with nothing to their name, without an education, without capital to build homes and businesses. These are human beings, and most of them don't even know their true name. We need to give them the dignity and the rights of citizens. Johnson says, yeah, they can have rights, but not the land. Stanton starts to have an asthmatic episode and says he has 40,000 land grants in the works right now. If they take the land away, they will see thousands in misery on the streets. Is that what Johnson wants? Is that the America Johnson wants? Well, Johnson isn't going to budge. He tells Stanton that if his ideas disturb him, he can find another war secretary. Stanton keeps pushing, reminding him that 200,000 African Americans served in Union uniform and many gave their lives for this country. Johnson's had enough, and he shouts, "They can't have the land!" Except he calls African Americans a horrible word that shows what a racist he is, and I certainly won't be repeating it. Johnson tries to collect himself and tells Stanton to assign troops to undo the land grants, or he'll find someone who will. Stanton, struggling to breathe, tells Johnson he is making a mistake, one that could take decades to mend. Please, he's begging, keep the order. Johnson tells him it's not a game. Well, you're the one treating it like one, number 2, and I don't mean to reference your former VP title. I'm referencing the U.S. News & World Report that came out in February 2024 that had you as the second worst president of all time. Number 1 is James Buchanan. But trust me, polls over the last few years have you two constantly battling it out for number 1, and you are very worthy of it. Johnson, however, means what he says. Stanton leaves, still struggling with his lungs, and an African-American servant shuts the door behind him, leaving him alone in the room with Johnson. In a dream sequence, I think we'd all like to see the servant take the racist tailor to the cleaners. In real history, Johnson does take back the land grants, but it's several months later than what they show here. It will be September 1865. The grants were never given to former enslaved people beyond the initial plots of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. So when we saw Mary Sims get a land grant in episode 3, that storyline was constructed so we could see the impact of her getting that grant and then having it taken away without adding another character or storyline. Johnson and Stanton in real life had a very difficult path together, so difficult that it would lead to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1867. And if anyone doubts Johnson's attitudes towards African Americans, I think Frederick Douglass acts as a great source. Over a decade after Johnson's presidency, Douglass would write in his book, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, that he noticed Johnson glancing at him with a look of bitter contempt and aversion. Douglass turned to his companion and said, whatever Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race. So when we see Johnson meeting with what looks to be Southern representatives and all the scenes surrounding the land grants, it might not be historically accurate or within this time frame, but it's meant to show just how much Lincoln's death changed the course, not just of the entire country, but for the entire race of African Americans. Lincoln wasn't perfect. He didn't always have the best ideas at first, but he listened and he learned from people who knew more about these matters than he did, and at the end he usually came to the right decision. This was shown in episodes 1 and 2, where Stanton found Lincoln to be someone open to a different approach, where we even saw Lincoln meeting with Frederick Douglass on 2 occasions asking for his advice. But with Johnson, there's obviously no room for change or compromise. This is a guy who feels more at home with people who just echo his own beliefs. We're now at the War Department, and Stanton is talking to the head of the telegraph office, Tecumseh Eckert. Stanton thinks there must be something they can do, some power play move, but Eckert has to be the practical one in this argument. Stanton's going to have to let this one go. He doesn't have a choice. If he resigns or Johnson replaces him, everything he has worked for and planned will all be lost. Johnson is the president. It's Stanton's duty to obey him as part of the cabinet. His new role is to temper Johnson's worst instincts. That's all he can do. Stanton wonders if Johnson is bluffing, but Eckert believes Johnson will show him the door, and he's right. Stanton explains that the land grants are the foundation of Reconstruction. He promised Abe, but Eckert asks, how are you going to finish his work if you risk your position? And that's a good point, reminding him that he's the only one who can work towards all the changes he and Lincoln had worked so hard to craft. Eckert tells him, sadly, that it's a tragedy, but he needs to let the land grants go, then work on putting things in place to protect the rest of Reconstruction. Eckert says he needs to do what he did to gain advantage in the war. Stand the offensive, choose your battles. This is a fictional conversation, but how Stanton conducts business in real life after Lincoln's death very much follows the advice Eckert gives here. I've said this before, but Stanton will do everything he can to keep the United States from complete ruin under President Johnson. And he's not alone. He has people like Secretary of State William Seward. He has General Grant. These people are also going to do their part, but it really comes down to what he and Lincoln had worked on when it came to Reconstruction. In reality, there are really only 2 things we can thank Johnson for. 1, letting Mary Lincoln stay in the White House for over a month after her husband is killed, so it gives her time to adjust, to go through things, and to be able to say goodbye properly. And number 2, being so despicable that General Ulysses S. Grant feels he must run for president because there's just no way he can support or campaign for Johnson. And Johnson wants that from him. He wants to have Grant off his shoulder to give him legitimacy and to give him favor, and he does use Grant in that way during his presidency, but when it comes to running again for president, there is no way Grant is going to let that happen. He has absolutely no respect for that man. Okay, I think this is a good point to stop at, so I will save the rest for part 2. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't done so you don't miss out. Since I'm a new channel, if you liked the video, I'd be grateful for any likes or shares as well. I will be completing recaps for the rest of the series. I hope I've been able to answer some of the questions you may have had. Were you excited to get back to the manhunt? Because I admit that I was. Anyway, I will see you in the next video, and as always, I bid you an affectionate farewell.